Now, next Sunday, we are starting our children's practice and our children's choir practice. It's going to be in between the two morning services. I'm really excited about that. I'm glad that our children have the opportunity to learn gospel-centered songs. Music is portable theology. You take it with you wherever you go. It shapes how you learn. It shapes how you live. Music is on the lips of people from the age of 4 to 104. When I was a child growing up in North Carolina, I grew up near the universities of North Carolina State, Duke, and Wake Forest. And I was taught some songs with some strong theology in it. This was one. Wake is fake, Duke is puke, the team I hate is NC State, go Tar Heels. Those are the songs I learned in my children's choir. So I'm a big Tar Heel fan, but I recognize talent when I see it. This week, I was reading about a guy named Anthony Davis. He's the power forward who, before he was paid to play in the NBA, was paid to play at the University of Kentucky. And he's also known as the Brow because he has the world's largest unibrow. In junior high school, he was known as the little guy who would shoot threes from the corner. But between his freshman year and his senior year, he grew from 6 foot to 6'10". I mean, can you imagine that growth? I peaked out at age 12. This guy kept growing. Davis went from being recruited only by Cleveland State to the best high school player in the country. But with all of this growth came some heartache. He had to change his game. He had to learn to play inside instead of outside. He couldn't mimic Steve Nash anymore. His mom would take him to the doctor because she thought something was wrong with him. She would buy him pants and he would grow out of them in a week. She'd say, "Hey, didn't I buy those pants for you last summer?" He'd say, "You bought them 2 weeks ago." And she was like, "This can't be normal. We've got a freak of nature on our hands." So for Davis, growth pains were great blessings, but they brought about great challenges. And it mimics what's taking place in Acts chapter 6. The situation is clear from verse 1. On the one hand, in those days, the number of the disciples were increasing. On the other hand, complaints. Problems came because of growth. The church is growing quickly, and it's causing some growing pains. The Greek-speaking widows and the Jewish widows, they're about to throw down. All right, they're not, but pretty close. There's just drama when things begin to grow. Tony Morita has a saying around his house. It goes like this. Tells it to his kids. Save your drama for your mama because Papa don't want to hear it. Well, what's happening in this text is everybody is saving the drama for the leaders of the church, the apostles, and they are bringing it to the apostles. In Acts chapter 6, the church is growing, but there are growing pains. And think about what these apostles could have thought when people were coming to them with their problems. I mean, they could have thought this: hey, 5,000 people got saved last week, and you're complaining because we overlooked feeding a couple of widows? Let's put this story in its context. I brought a chart with me. There's 3 ways you can divide up the book of Acts. Acts 1 through 7, Acts 8 through 12, and Acts 13 through 28. So the gospel is moving in chapters 1 through 7 to Jerusalem. The gospel is moving in chapters 8 through 12 to Judea and Samaria, further out. And then in 13 through 28 to the ends of the world. So see what is happening here. The church is on the verge, chapter 6, of an evangelism explosion. They were about to go beyond Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. But first, they had to get organized. Now, last week, the message was very heavy. There was just a lot of gravity to that text. Next week, it's going to be pretty heavy as well, because we're talking about the martyrdom of Stephen. But this week, we're just covering 7 verses, and it is extremely practical. So here's what I want to talk to you about today. Growing pains. And I'm not talking about Kirk Cameron and that show that a couple of you grew up on. I'm not talking about adolescents growing pains. I'm talking about church growing pains. So here's the topic. Here's the theme. Growing pains. overcoming challenges to church growth. As I was studying this week, I think just right off of the pages, there were 3 ways that this text hits our church and where we are at this moment. Here's the first way. We should celebrate gospel-centered growth. This passage is about church growth. It's where Luke has been, and it's where he is going in the book of Acts. Now, let me clarify some things. This passage isn't secrets to church growth. And not all church growth is good. You can be a mile wide and an inch deep, and we want to stay away from that. But we don't want to make any apology for authentic church growth. And you know, some people are really negative about churches that are big. They'll say things like, you know what, I don't ever mention numbers. Well, Acts did. Notice verse 1. They were increasing in number. God is not afraid of numbers. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, numbers. He named a book of the Bible Numbers. All right, actually we did, but that's a conversation for another time. Well, we count people because people count. Some churches will say, we don't count people. We care for them. Doesn't that just sound like something that would come out of my mouth? That just sounds like something else. We don't count people. We care for people. Well, that really makes no sense. I mean, we don't do this with our kids. Getting on an airplane, we have 4 kids. 1, 2, 3. Oh, I don't count them. I care for them. Let's go. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to count people. We're not into math. We are into growth. And what you have here in verse 1 and verse 7 is what theologians called an inclusio. It's a grammatical technique, an inclusio. Number is mentioned in verse 1, and number is mentioned in verse 7, and so it brackets what's in between. Everything you see in between are the pains that come along with church growth. And we don't have anyone like this here. I've never heard it. But I have heard people say, you know what, I just like things the way they are right now. I don't want to change. How many of you have ever been in a church and you've heard that? All right, the rest of you probably lying, right? Yeah, we've heard that. But being content with the lack of growth shows that we don't take God's command seriously. So we want spiritual growth here, but we also want numerical growth. But we are keenly aware that God alone gives both. The goal is not bigger buildings, a bigger staff, or a bigger budget. I mean, please, God has rescued us from that rat race. Most churches, they judge their success on the 3 B's. Budgets, buildings, and bottoms. How many bottoms they have. God never measures a church's success that way. So here's the goal. It's in verse 1. Here's our goal. It's twofold. That the word of God will be increased and that the disciples will be multiplied. So this is the first way that this text hits our church and hits you at this time. We should celebrate gospel-centered growth. Here's the second way. We should expect problems when the church grows. We should expect problems when the church grows. Let me just give you a couple of ageless truths about growing churches. Here's one. Vibrant, effective, growing churches are not immune to problems. An inevitable messiness always accompanies a gospel ministry that is growing. And so we don't deny that we're a little messy around here. It is a mistake to romanticize and idolize the early church. If anybody says, you know what, I wish we could just go back to the first century church. Now they typically mean, by that saying, they typically mean, let's get back to when the church was small enough for everybody to know everybody and everything was peachy clean. Have you ever read the book of Acts? Like, it's not peachy clean there. It's not peachy clean. It wasn't peachy clean last week. It's not going to be peachy clean next week. And may I remind you that there were 20,000 people making up the church at Jerusalem at this time. These believers are meeting regularly in a temple with its stone structure, its huge corridors, and its canopies. They were crammed into the temple one day a week and then into homes all throughout the week. It was so large that people barely knew anyone. So they had problems. Did they have a lot of wins? Yes, they had a lot of wins. I mean, can you imagine just talking to someone that went to this church? Hey, where do you go to church? Oh, I go to the one in the book of Acts. What's your pastor's name? Peter? Do they preach the Bible over there? No, our pastors, they write the Bible. I mean, that's a pretty big church there. That's a pretty special church. So did they have wins? Yes. Did they have failures? Yes. And we're going to focus on one of those failures of the church today. So whenever you study the Bible, in order to find the author's intent, we have to ask some questions. And so here's the question we ask with this text. What fostered the response that takes place in these verses? In chapter 5, the church members were laying money at the apostles' feet. We find out in chapter 6 that the people were not happy with what the apostles were doing with the money that they were placing at their feet. Look, Luke is a realist. Not everything was running smoothly in the church. Let me just give a little evangelistic sidebar here. If you're not a Christian, you just kind of strolled in here this morning. We have skeptics that come week after week. And God has piqued your curiosity. You're not even sure why you come over and over and over again, but you're here. So if you're not a Christian, we want you to understand something. We do not claim to be perfect at Faith Family Church. Sometimes we're not even all on the same page. Maybe you say, you know what, I have problems like that in my life. Well, how do you react to them? Maybe you're the type of person, when things don't go your way, you take your ball and you go home. Or maybe you're the type of person that you have a pattern of just telling people off right to their face. You just let them have it. Nobody's going to get the best of you. Well, if you don't tell them off to their face, you tell them off in your mind. You ever done that? Like some people, before they ever get out of the shower in the morning, they've been in 3 fights. Not really, but in their mind, they've been going at it with people. So if you're not a Christian, here's what I encourage for you to do. I would encourage for you to stick around here long enough to see how gospel-centered people work through disagreements. We are not a community of perfect people. We are a community of people who have been redeemed by a perfect Savior. Jesus Christ rose from the dead to defeat sin and death, to save you from the wrath of God. And once that big debt is paid, every other problem in your life will seem very small. And so in our text today, the church is only 6 months old. Check it out. Already there's a problem. There's a complaint in the church. The Greek word complaint, I would translate it this way. People were running their mouths. People are talking about it in the parking lot. It's the topic of conversation over dinner as telephone calls are being made. Have you heard about the problem? And then they would say stuff like this. Well, let me tell you about it so you can put it on your prayer list. Yeah, that's what's happening. Now, do not misunderstand. The complaint in this text was serious, and it was legitimate. I'm going to describe it for you in a moment. But for now, I want you to understand that Satan can use legitimate concerns as a tool to destroy the church. Satan can use legitimate concerns as a tool to destroy your walk with Christ. The great red dragon will stop at nothing to destroy a growing church. In Acts chapter 4, he uses persecution. In Acts chapter 5, he uses hypocrisy. In Acts chapter 6, he uses distraction. He says, let me preoccupy the people with complaining, and let me preoccupy the apostles with social administration. And I think this might be the most serious threat that endangers churches. So there are 2 groups of widows in the church. Let me give those to you. You've got the Hebrew widows and the Hellenistic widows. So let's start with, who are these Hebrew widows? They were descendants of these faithful Jews who were driven out in the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivity. If you associate with the book of the Bible, think of it with the times of Jonah and the book of Daniel. So they were driven out with the Assyrian and the Babylonian conquest. They stayed there for a while. Then they left Babylon under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. They came back to Jerusalem, and they did the hard work of rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem and rebuilding the cities. These people were committed to the Hebrew scriptures, and they were committed to the language, to the Hebrew language. So that's the Hebrew widows. They were descendants of these people. Then you've got these Hellenistic widows. The Hellenistic Jews descended from the Jews who had chosen, for whatever reason, to live outside the land of Palestine. They were still Jews, but they spoke Greek, and they absorbed some of the Greek culture into their lifestyle. According to the Hebrew writings, the Hellenists were frequently categorized as second-class Israelites. They were considered tainted by the Greek world. And so, as these people started to grow older, in the later years, they wanted to be buried near Jerusalem, so they left and they moved back into Jerusalem. As they began to die off, widows were left with no family nearby or family that did not want to take care of them. And we know this goes on for years and years because Paul is collecting money for the poor saints in Jerusalem and taking it back to them. This is a problem that the church dealt with for a lot. And William Barclay sets the stage for us. So let me quote him just to prove to you that I can quote people. All right. He wrote this. In the synagogue, there was a routine custom. 2 collectors went around the market and private houses every Friday morning and made a collection for the needy, partly in money and partly in goods. Later in the day, this was distributed. It is clear, he says, that the Christian church had taken over the same custom. And these Hellenistic widows were missing out on the food distribution. Meals on Wheels isn't coming by my house anymore. What's going on? Now, this was a pretty dangerous problem because there's an edge to it. It's a racial problem. You are prioritizing this group of people over this group of people because of cultural ethnicity. I've been studying it all week and reading commentary after commentary on it. And you say, Kyle, do you believe the complaint of discrimination was rooted in actual fact? I don't believe so. I believe it was rooted in oversight. The problem is not a sin issue, but a capacity issue. People were living beyond their capacity to care for all of these widows. But either way, it highlights some possible sensitive spots for you. We live in the U.S., so we typically think of discrimination just one way. But it's much broader than that. Some countries possess discrimination against other countries. They'll say things like this: if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. In the States, there's an unspoken snobbery between the white-collar workers and the blue-collar. Or in the military, where some of you live, an officer and an enlisted. Or maybe where some of the rest of you live, rich and not so rich. What about in the parking lot? Somebody pulls up in a Mercedes-Benz, and then someone pulls up beside them in a vehicle that's not a Mercedes-Benz. They are much more spiritually discerning, so they bought a Ford pickup truck. And you guys with Ford pickup trucks, you shouldn't look down on those people that drive Mercedes-Benz. They don't know any better. You know what Ford stands for, right? First on race day. Found on road dead. All right, that's another one too. Here's what I want to get across to you. It can be an incredible testimony to those who are non-Christians. And I would go as far as to say this: our church has had an incredible testimony to those who are non-Christians in this community, in Oak Grove, in Clarksville, in Hopkinsville. An incredible testimony as a place where we do not allow prejudice to have a place. It will not have a place in this church. See, people who see a church like that are not just persuaded by it, they are attracted to it. So you say, Kyle, I'm part of the body, part of the body. Let me give you some part of the body principles to follow. We see in this text from verse 1, bring your problems to the right people. Bring your problems to the right people. And I feel so unusual just talking about this because Sarah and I have been here for 16 months and we haven't had any problems. And you say, well, why are you talking about problems? Because the text talks about problems, right? And we're pretty into just preaching the very next verse. So Bring your problems to the right people. Go straight to the source. Put this in your life. If you've got a problem with someone, maybe it's in your job or in your family or whatever, go straight to the source. Never tell a problem to someone that can't fix it. Do you know how much disharmony this would avoid if you operated that way? And there's a hint in the text here that these people were not doing that. The Hellenistic widows were raising the complaint with other widows. So there's a mixture of truth and sin in their complaint. You say, Kyle, who's the right person to take it to? Who should they have taken it to? The leaders of the church. That would be the apostles in their day and the pastors in our day. How many of you have ever babysitted, maybe as a teenager? Any of you ever babysitted as a teenager? Yeah. No one ever called me to do that because they valued their children. But from time to time, my aunt would ask me to house sit while she went on vacation. Really not a smart move on her part at all. Dog sitting is pretty popular today. When you care about something, you appoint people to care for it. And so God cares about the church, and here's what he does. He appoints people to care for it. They're called pastors or bishops or elders. All of those names mean the same exact thing, and they're always in the plural. Here are two rules in my life that I try to teach our team here, and it'd be good for you just to implement into your everyday life. Here's the first. Always give people the benefit of the doubt about their motives when you can. Always give people the benefit of doubt about their motives when you can. Here's the second. Whenever you bring a problem to someone, bring a solution with it. Bring a solution with it. It requires no spiritual gift to recognize a problem. The only requirement for that is to be a negative Nancy. We don't want to be that. At our jobs or in our families or wherever, we don't want to be that. So whenever we bring a problem to someone, let's also bring a solution. I was looking at this church and I thought, why did God allow a problem to come into a growing church? Why would God allow that? And then it hit me. God allows problems in churches to raise up new leaders. And that's exactly what happened in this text. Crisis clarifies priorities. If you have ever received a bad health diagnosis, you realize this. Crisis clarifies priorities. And this text implies that the apostles were caring for the widows themselves. Every day, they were giving the food themselves. Naturally, they assumed, you know what, it's our job to do this. They would call them up and say, hey, what are you doing? I'm going to swing by Costco. I'm going to pick up some bacon. I'm going to drop it by Esther's house. Oh, okay. Are you walking today? No, I'm driving my donkey. All right, let me know how she's doing. You see, this is how simple it was in the early days. 1 widow, 6 widows, and then suddenly, massive growth, 70 widows, 200 widows. And as the church increased, these leaders couldn't do all the errands, and they couldn't keep up with the administration. They couldn't handle it. And so what would the church do? The church didn't fix it with a short-term solution. They didn't put a Band-Aid on it. No, they chose 7 men to take care of the task. You've heard the 7 men. You heard Rachel read those 7 men earlier. I would read them myself, but they're hard to pronounce. So I'll just leave that to Rachel. So these 7 men, some say they're deacons. I'm not going to argue there, but they're not. The officer of a deacon doesn't appear anywhere in the book of Acts. That office comes later. But I would say that these men took up the function of a deacon long before the office existed in the church. These men take care of the problems to where they are no longer problems. And there's an avalanche of texts in the Old Testament about caring for widows. We will, hear me church, care for widows in this church, no matter the age. And some of you know we've got friends that we love right now that are battling cancer at 29 years of age. And it won't be long until he goes home to see Jesus. And then we'll have a 29-year-old widow here. Hear me. This church, we will take care of widows. But we won't stop there. Realize what this Bible is saying. Widow is pointing to those who are weak and vulnerable in a society. It's pointing to orphans. It's pointing to refugees. It's pointing to everyone. So you see these disciples here, they want to reach out to the weak in the society. But at the same time, they want to protect their biblical priorities. So the apostles didn't view this social ministry as inferior to pastoral ministry. Like, oh, that is just beneath my dignity to do that. No, that's not what they were doing. They were saying it's not right. That's the words they use. In other words, it's not pleasing to God that we would leave our task of doing this to do this. And there's a Greek word called diakonoi. It's often translated in the Bible deacon. Diakonoi. We didn't have a word for it in English, so we just made a word and we said deacon. Well, that word appears 3 times in these 7 verses, but not one time is it translated deacon. It's translated distribution, it's translated serve, and it's translated ministry. The last one is when the apostles were saying, we do the ministry of the word. So get the picture here. There's a group of people who distribute food, and then there's a group of people who distribute the word. These men set the priority of teaching over everything else in the church. Now, when a pastor says, if I were to come up to you and I would say, it may sound humble, but I would say, you know what, I'm going to be available for counseling whenever you need it. I'm going to vacuum the floor. I'm going to come early and I'm going to set up all the chairs. That would sound pretty humble. But here's what this text is telling us, that would be prideful if I were to say that. Because here's what it's saying, that I don't believe the importance of prayer, prep for preaching, and the preaching event is as important as God says it is. Not too long ago, I guess a year or so, Sarah and I went to meet with a guy named Stephen Davey. He's a pastor in North Carolina. Maybe it was 2 years ago. And he was telling us how his church functions and how he lives out this passage and other passages. And it was really interesting. He said when he first got started, he outsourced all of his counseling until he could hire a professional counselor at the church. And he would only visit people if they had life-threatening diseases. It kind of breaks the model of some of you that may have been in a traditional church back in the day. You know, you have toenail surgery, you think, where's the pastor at? I've got an ingrown toenail. And so he just kind of broke all of that. It's pretty interesting. I don't see pastors prioritizing like this. I'm not saying a pastor should go this far, what this man did. But I'm not seeing pastors prioritizing prayer and the word like this anymore. And why not? Just put yourself in this church. If you were in this church, if I was in this church, I could probably accuse these apostles of not being available, of not having compassion. What are they going to do all day? You're going to sit in a room and pray and read a book? Is that what you're going to do all day? But notice, no matter what the critics said, they said our priorities are prayer and preaching. Now, I have to fight this. Not fight this with any pull from you, because there's absolutely no pull. I think you have actually too low of an expectation for your pastor, honestly. If we fought, that's the way we fought on. We fought that way. But I have to fight this all the time because I want to do different things. You know, I want to go out, I want to go out, I want to go out, I want to do this. Everything seems more urgent than prayer and preaching until the opening prayer of a Sunday morning. And then you realize nothing is more important. When other things begin to take the place of preaching to the pastors of the church, you will see it. Here's what it will look like. The preaching will become flat. This machine may keep growing, but what gave it life is missing. Many of you lead businesses, or maybe you lead soldiers. You have some people under you. Maybe you're an office manager, ladies, and you lead ladies. Or you're in a home and you lead children. You lead. Chuck Swindoll said this: the measure of a leader is the ability to say no without exclamation. That's the ability of a leader. So you say, this seems like very pastor focused, so how can we apply this to us? We can apply this to us. Are you prioritizing prayer in your life? Do you calendar it? So we live such distracted lives. And a distraction may not be sinful. It may simply sidetrack you. It may be a relationship that weakens your walk with God rather than encourages it. Perhaps it's an activity that in itself is not wrong, but it's wasteful evenings in front of the TV. It may be something in your life that's not necessarily revolting, but it does not refresh and vitalize your soul. Are we prioritizing prayer? So here's how this text hits us. It hits us this way. We should celebrate gospel-centered growth. 2, when the church grows, we should expect problems. 3, we should see growth problems as opportunities for more gospel-centered growth. Verse 7. You know what we find out in this church? This church grew as a result of how they handled internal strain. This faith family hears the complaint, owns up to the problem, allows those closest to the problem to solve it. Hellenistic Jews are going to serve Hellenistic widows. Allows those closest to the problem to solve it, delegates the authority to get it done, and then goes back to work. Is this not the normal church rhythm? Preach, pray, grow, drama, manage the drama. Preach, pray, grow, drama, manage the drama. Repeat cycle. I love verse 7 because it talks about all the priests coming to Christ. You think these priests would be Christ followers already, but these priests were coming to Christ. They were actually antagonistic toward Jesus. They actually helped lead in the crucifixion of Jesus. But now in verse 7, their hearts are changed. Through what? Through apologetic reasoning? No. Through the church's service and caring for the outcast, the fringes of society. If you're here today and you're a non-Christian, you say, I'm not a Christian. Some of you are like, Kyle, you know I'm not a Christian. We've had conversations about this, but you keep coming back. If you're not a Christian, and maybe you even hear the Bible preached sometimes and you think, you know what, I get a little angry while sitting here. Here's what I would say. Watch out. You may be converted to Christ soon. Because all of these people heard the word and they would get angry. Like there's just something that would boil up inside of them and says, I don't like this. I don't like them and I don't like their message. Look, I never imagined that I would be doing this. Never in a million years. I wanted to be a police officer. And then my stepfather was the sheriff of our county. And then that wasn't a possibility anymore. You know, you can't be a police officer when you're getting arrested all the time, right? Just kidding. All right, then I a little bit. Then I wanted to be a fireman, right? And so I wanted to, listen, this was not on my radar. And I didn't like Christians. I didn't want to hang around Christians. I didn't want to have anything to do with Christians. Actually, all the Christians I knew, I looked at their lives and I thought they seemed a little unusual. Like there was not one of them I could point to like, there's something in their lives that I like. I could point to all of them and be like, dude is weird. What is up with him? But what changed it? God was after me. Man, and God is after some of you. And you're here this morning not by mistake, not on our first Sunday at a 9 o'clock service. You're not here by mistake. You are here by divine appointment. So let me leave you with 5 ways this text, that God could use this text in your life. I told you last week I'm going to start preaching shorter. You guys knew I was lying, right? I mean, come on. That was a lie. All right, so let me give you 5 ways God could use this text in your life. So you say, Kyle, it's been very pastorish, very good for a seminary class. Like, get it down to where I live every day. Here's where you live every day. 5 ways God could use this text in your life. Way number 1, God could reveal an area of service to get involved. If you are not serving, realize there are others who are beyond their capacity in serving. And burnout could come soon, whether they realize it or not. And it's time for you to jump in and volunteer. We need more people to step up and say, you know what, I'll jump in here. I'll be a greeter. I'll work in the nursery. I'll start a small group. I'll serve in Wednesday nights. Now, when you walked in, you probably received one of these. If you did not, you can receive it on the way out. And if you're visiting with us and did not get your guest gift today, it's in the welcome tent on the way out. But notice this right here. Schedule for Wednesday night small groups and Faith Kids Night. In September, we are starting a whole new discipleship program for children ages 5 to 13. Here's what I've written. The ministry exists to glorify God by supporting parents in their God-given role to lead their children to follow and love Jesus Christ. This night is designed to safely nurture and train children ages 5 to 13 in the gospel of Jesus Christ while having lots of fun in the progress. So each night, instead of our small groups on Wednesdays, my small group met in here. It's morphed into a monster group, so we're starting a bunch of other small groups out of that. But no small groups will be meeting in here. This will be a 5 to 13-year-old children's discipleship time. Gospel-centered worship, age-appropriate teaching, high-energy games. From 6:30 to 8. We're going to have a nursery provided for infants to 4. So ideally, parents could come in here. Your children could be in a discipleship program here. And over here, we've got a bunch of adult small groups that are going to meet. We're going to need more volunteers in here as well to work with these kids. So God could use this to open your eyes the first time to be like, oh, you know what? I have never seen the fact that sometimes it's the same people doing all the work. I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to jump in. So that's one way. Here's the second way. God could reveal your gifts of service for this body. God has given you certain giftings. You say, no, I know, Kyle, I got a sweet jump shot. Well, there are other giftings as well, all right? There are other giftings that you have that are specifically and specially designed for this body. Now, before, I have used these 3 terms, prophet, priest, and king, to describe the work of an elder. But we could also use it to describe different giftings. Like some of you are prophets. You like teaching, and you like footnotes. Right? That's what really gets you excited. You even read them. All right? So some of you are priests. You love people. You're sensitive. You can connect. You say, how are you doing? And people just start bawling. Like you've got a connection. Some of you are kings. Your thing is administration, systems, and structures. Not everyone is good at everything. Some of you would not be good waiters at a restaurant. Big Bubba comes and sits at your table, and he orders a 24-ounce steak. And you're like, you should order a salad wrap. And you're looking a little pale. You should drink more water. Now, that's what a prophet would do in that situation. We need a priest. We need someone to love this brother and win him to Jesus and not your diet plan. Right? So there's different giftings. God calls all of his people to ministry. So here's one of the things I was trying to, as I'm working through the sermon process, like, all right, how can I get them to see that just not the pastors are called to ministry, but everybody's called to ministry? And I couldn't figure out how to get that across to you, so I'm like, well, why don't I just tell them? So that's what I'm doing. All right? Look, pastors aren't the only people called to ministry. If you're here today, you are called to ministry. And he calls different people to different ministries. God is the one who puts our church together. And he does it perfectly. You've got something you can contribute to the body. Number 3, God brings gifted people into the church to fill holes and complete the local body. Do you see something lacking in the body? Don't run off because it's not there. Supply it. Sometimes in the past, people have come to me and said, you know what, Faith Family Church, they really need this following ministry. We're missing it in this area. My response is always the same. You're absolutely right. We are missing it in that area. We do need that ministry. And since God has given you the insight for the potential for that ministry, I think you would be a great person to organize that ministry. Are you still here? No? You're gone? Come back? Yeah, there are a number of important responsibilities in this local body. So God has gifted you with government, arts, science, building, media, industry, home, hospitality. There's a place where you could jump in. You say, what if I'm not sure? Ask an elder. Hey, where's a place where I can work out my gifts? Here's some things that I'm pretty gifted at. All right, number 4. God could use this passage to show you how to lead effectively. Some of you are leaders. You lead at your job. You're gonna go home, take an afternoon nap. That's why you were so happy about this early 9 o'clock service starting. Lengthens your nap. You're gonna go home, take a 9 o'clock nap, 11 o'clock nap, and then you're gonna wake up in the morning and you're gonna go lead people. And this passage will help you lead effectively. Your leadership will not go very far if you don't allow others to lead beside you. That's just the truth. Not all churches, but some churches that are stuck between 75 people and 100 people, They're there because that's all the pastor can reasonably handle. That's all the weddings he can handle, the preaching he can handle, the visitation load. That's all the people he can know their names and be in their lives. Could you be limiting your job? Why do people not turn things over? They want to keep their hands on it. I've seen it. Listen, I've seen it in church, and that's just my avenue. You know, you could give tons of examples about your job. I've seen it in church, like 10 people showing up, and they're still straightening up the chairs. Like, friend, the Titanic is sinking. Get out of the water. Kick that chair over and go to safety. And, you know, some people may have an unhealthy ownership of something. I tend to have that a lot because I'm a perfectionist. Make room for others. Delegate. Just recently, through my prayer time, I've been working through how my perfectionism could cripple the growth of the church. And my wife helps with that because sometimes my wife's like, hey, you think your perfectionism could be holding people back from serving? I'm like, no. Later, probably so. Probably so. We have more people attending than one person can care for. So that's why we have shepherd leaders. So you see on the back of this sheet, we have Sunday groups, Tuesday groups, Wednesday groups. If you're not in a group, we'd love for you to get in a group. But this is our implementation of Acts chapter 6. I just wanted you to see it on paper. This is our implementation of Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. The larger we get, the smaller we want to make it. When most people complain about large churches, and I jump in that, I do that as well. When we complain about large churches, what we're complaining about is a lack of relationships and friendliness. So the bigger we get, the smaller we want to make it. We want to be more relationship-centered and more friendly. So these groups here, this is where you can work out your gifts. These are like small churches. When they're in the hospital, you visit them. You counsel with them. You have compassion with them. You encourage them. You know these people. You teach these people. You warn these people. You encourage these people. It's like little churches. Yesterday, I was reading a book called The Trellis and the Vine. You know what a trellis is, right? The lattice-like stuff where the vine grows on. And this book was comparing ministry to the trellis and the vine. He says the vine work is very organic soul growth. The trellis work is structuring for effective growth. And the goal of a church is not to just have beautiful trellis. Actually, the trellis should not even be seen. The structure should not even be seen. The only purpose of the structure is to keep the growth coming. Church is an organism and an organization. It's an organism, it's very vine, but it's also an organization. We learned from 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, manage the household of God. So it's both. Sometimes you have vine churches. They're very big on conversions, they're very big on discipleship, very big on life, but they're so disorganized, they're hindering discipleship growth. Sometimes you have trellis churches. They're big on committees and events and infrastructure and programs and a budget. Trellis churches often look impressive, but it's just a matter of time until the trellis takes over the vine. All you can see is just the structure. You don't see any fruit. You don't see any growth anymore. We could build a trellis around here until we reach heaven, but without vine growth, it's in vain. Structures don't grow ministries any more than trellises grow vines. And so here's what I love in this text. Verse 1, it's vine growth. People are multiplying, disciples are growing, the word is moving out. Verse 1, it's vine growth. Verse 2 through 6 is trellis work. Organization, structure. We have people that are falling through the gaps, right? And this is our attempt at this, so nobody falls through the gaps. So you have vine work, verse 1, trellis work, verse 2 through verse 6, and then verse 7, you have vine work again. But without the trellis work in verses 2 through 6, you would not have the extra vine growth in verse 7. Just wouldn't have it. All right, last one, and then I'm done. God could use this to encourage you not to be a fan, but be a player. Some of you are really benefiting from the body here. You're being discipled, you're being encouraged, you're joining in corporate worship, you're being inspired. Here's my push to you. Don't be a fan. Get on the team. Jump in a place of service. Jump in a small group. Support what's going on here. You say, Kyle, I don't know if you have a place for my gifting. At this point, I don't know if you have a place for my gifting. In this text, the two names that are easy to pronounce, I'll give them. All right, Stephen and Philip. Stephen and Philip were obviously gifted for speaking and teaching. We know that from the next two chapters. They're preachers. But for this time, they said, we're in. We'll serve tables. We'll do it. See, a church must be full of people that are willing to serve in the shadows, willing to meet someone's need without being seen. Jesus didn't convert you just to show up. He converted you and I to serve.